Most Christians that I know have trust issues. I don't necessarily mean trust issues with other people. I'm talking about trust issues with God, myself included. We struggle to trust God that He will provide our daily bread or provide for us financially. We sometimes don't trust God to take care of our children or to guide them and direct them. We struggle to trust Him when He says that He loves us unconditionally and He's forgiven us, past, present, and future. We panic in a pandemic, and we don't trust Him with our health, and we don't trust Him with the government. We just struggle to trust. Now, there's an exception to this, of course. There are those few Christians who have been given the spiritual gift of faith. That supercharged, Holy Spirit-empowered ability to possess unwavering trust. They may not say this, but their life would exude it. God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. But for most of us, we will learn to trust God over time. Consider this. Consider the typical trust-growing cycle. We know as Christians we're supposed to trust God, but something happens in our life that distracts us or panics us or puzzles us. And so we go about fixing it, solving it, healing it in our own way, what we're used to doing. And eventually we reap the difficulty of a life lived in our own strength, according to our own wisdom. We realize we should have been trusting God all along. And at the end of that, we say, next time, I'm going to trust God. And then unsurprisingly, the next time comes. Another issue or the same issue occurs, and we immediately run to trusting our own thoughts, our own perspective, our own ingenuity. And again, we reap the difficulty that comes when we trust ourselves and not God. And somewhere along that process, earlier than before, but later than we should have, we say, I should be trusting God. Maybe next time. Next time comes, we start trusting, and then after about 30 minutes, we go back to our old ways of trusting our own intelligence and our own ingenuity. We catch ourselves and we go, oh, I can't believe I did it again. I should have trusted. And the next time comes, and we trust Him on and off. We really struggle to keep our faith here and not here. For a few days we're successful, and then for the next few days we succumb to our old trusting habits of ourselves. And over time, as that pattern repeats, Lord willing, it gets better, slowly, over time, as we eat the fruit of distrust, but as we also experience the joy and the peace that comes from a trusting life. I want you to think back over this study of the children of Israel as they exit Egypt. I think their story of trust and distrust and God trying to grow trust is exactly what you and I experience. And we may not have come out of Egyptian slavery, but we've come out of slavery to sin, where we trusted self and we relied only on ourselves. The question for Israel, and often the question that we ask, whether we ask it verbally or just in the way we live, is will God be faithful to His promise, and can I trust Him? Israel has said no time and time again, and she says a big no at Kadesh Barnea when she refuses to go into the land. Israel decides to go back into the land to take Ai, even though God said that they're going to wander in the wilderness, and they put their trust in themselves and they just get slaughtered. So they go into the wilderness. And even as you read their wilderness wanderings in Numbers, you begin to see this pattern of sin, of self-trust, learning to trust, sin of self-trust, learning to trust. And what are they doing? God is trying to build trust in the lives of his people, that they'll trust him. And the way he's done that is to live with them. And the other way he's done that is to talk to them. And we see that in the book of Genesis. In chapters 1 and 2, God demonstrates in chapter 1 that he is the creator of all things. He is Elohim. In chapter 2, he reminds Israel that he is a covenant-making, covenant-keeping God. He is Yahweh. In chapter 3, we realize that man does trust in himself, and he eats of the fruit of the tree, and all of mankind plummets into this growing downward spiral of sin. Israel sees her own downward spiral of self-trust and self-worship and sin. What hope does she have? Her hope is our hope, to trust in God who makes promises and is faithful to keep promises. That's what we're going to look at today in Genesis chapter 5 as we look at the lineage of Seth. Remember, Genesis 3:15, God said that there would be open war against Eve's seed, Eve's offspring, and Satan's offspring. That's more than just physical, but it's also spiritual. And that evil would cause a disruption to all things, but eventually righteousness would prevail, crush the head of the serpent, and bring us back into the garden of rest and promise and a relationship with God. Just as Israel is looking to go back to the promised land, the descendants of Adam and Eve are looking to go back into the garden. Why? That's where rest is. That's where God is. But when we come to the end of Genesis 4, we realize that sin has magnified to untold, immeasurable proportions. What hope is there? Has God forgotten or not intended or not powerful enough to keep his promise in Genesis 3:15? And Genesis 5 reminds us that he is and that he's trustworthy. I just kind of want to walk with you today in Genesis 5 and hope to give you, as I think Moses is trying to do, reasons and inspiration to trust God. Okay? Let's take your Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 starts out and says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam." Genesis is divided up into 10 different units. This next unit is from Genesis 5:1 to Genesis 6:8. And you'll notice in this downward spiral of sin in Genesis 4, it ends in verses 25 and 26 with this. "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, 'God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him.' To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord." And what he's going to do in chapter 5 is he's going to shine a spotlight on this appointed lineage of Seth. He says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created Adam, or created man, he made him in the likeness of God, male and female, he created them." This is a restatement of the Genesis account, or the creation of man. "Male and female, he created them, and blessed them, and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his own image, and named him Seth. And the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Adam lived were 930 years, and he died." I want you to notice that in God's plan to fulfill his promise, his program is not a what, it's a who. The whole book of Genesis is about a righteous remnant of people that God is graciously protecting and leading and guiding. That we look now back, and we can look at Luke chapter 3, and we see all these people named in the lineage of the Son of God, Jesus Christ. When we look at Genesis 3:15, as Seth's lineage looks at Genesis 3:15, as the Israelites would have just learned about Genesis 3:15, the first promise of the gospel, we recognize that God's not doing a what, he's doing a who. He's raising up a people to take people back into a restored relationship with him. Thus, the emphasis on Seth. It's also interesting here that in chapter 4, although Cain's descendants are listed, Moses spends no time talking about how long they lived or even if they died. Now, the truth is, they probably did live a long time. The truth is, they all did die. But Moses is just kind of going through Cain's lineage. But now he's going to slow it down in chapter 5, and he's going to make a point that of the millions of people that are living on the earth at this time, it's this guy who fathered this guy, who fathered this guy, who fathered this guy, who fathered this guy. This is how long they lived. This is who they fathered. This is how long they lived afterwards. This is how they died. And there's going to be this cadenced march down through Genesis 5. Why? He's highlighting that this is God's appointed family. Okay. It's interesting through here that you'll see repeated many times, like in verse 6. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters. All these guys had other sons and daughters. Not only does he spend a limited amount of time on Cain's lineage, he spends 0 time on the other sons and daughters. Now, I don't think that's because God doesn't love the other sons and daughters. It's not to say that the other sons and daughters are not important in the plan of God. But the point of Genesis 5 is to demonstrate that there are specific people that God is working through a specific family to bring about a specific salvation and the keeping of the promise that he made in Genesis 3:15. The promise in Genesis 3:15 is about offspring. It's about children who are going to be raised up righteous, someone in Eve's lineage is going to take them back. Who is it? It's Seth. Through Enosh. Through Enosh's son down the line till we see Jesus. And Moses' silence about these other children should be deafening to us. Why? Because he's raising up, this is God's plan for salvation. It's interesting too here, and this should inspire our trust, that Seth's name means the appointed one. Look in Genesis 4, in verse 25, it says, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel." Now, if you have kids, you know that Seth is not a substitute for Abel in a familial sense. The birth of Seth doesn't take away the pain of the death of Adam. Or the death of Abel. But Abel's death was not just the death of a lost relationship with the son. It was also the death of their hope of being restored to a garden-like relationship with each other and with God. For all Adam and Eve knew, God was going to keep his promise in Genesis 3:15 in Abel. Abel was leading them back, and then Abel dies. Which is probably why Cain killed him, to thwart God's plan of keeping his promise. If you can imagine what that would feel like, I mean, Mary probably felt very similar in the death of Jesus. Jesus' death is certainly the death of a son for his disciples. It's certainly the death of a friend. But Jesus' death is more than that to them, isn't it? They had hopes and dreams of a future kingdom that was going to come right now. That Jesus was going to restore them, and he was going to restore the kingdom promised to David, by the way, who is in the lineage of Seth. But when Jesus dies, it's more than just the death of a friend. It's the death of hope. It's the death of getting back. It's the death of restoration. And so we see here with Seth's birth is more than just he's not a replacement son, but he is a substitute. Seth is the new substitute for a promised lineage that's going to fulfill Genesis 3:15. Like God provides the ram for Abraham and Isaac on the mount, And just as Jesus is a substitute for us, why? Because we were dead. We were dead in our trespasses and sins. Abel's dead. There can be no hope except for a substitute. And so Seth comes in and he becomes the appointed one. Somehow Adam and Eve knew that Seth was a part of that appointed process. It's also interesting to me in Genesis 5 when we're thinking about inspiring trust, is Genesis 5 starts off with the substitute, Seth, and it ends with a deliverer, Noah. Look with me in chapter 5, verse 28. When Lamech had lived 182 years, this is not the Lamech of Genesis 4. This is another Lamech. Noah's dad. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord had cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. And Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 775 years, and he died. Isn't it interesting at the end of a chapter that is highlighting the appointed lineage of God to restore garden relationship? There is something that Lamech is thinking about. And what is it? He's thinking about the ground being cursed. He's thinking about painful toil of the hands. He's thinking about the ground being cursed because of Adam and Eve's sin. He's thinking about what happened in the garden. Why? Because this lineage is interested in having a restored relationship with God and getting back into the garden. That's their thought of how Genesis 3:15 is going to be fulfilled. And what does he name his son? He names his son Noah. The name Noah means rest. Now I would think to a wandering wilderness generation who refused to go into the promised land of rest, it would not have been lost on them as they rejected rest. And at this time, as in the wilderness wandering, they probably would want some rest, that Noah arrives on the scene and his name means rest. Now, Lamech had no way of fathoming Noah being a part of a global flood. Okay? But it is going to be through Noah, through Seth, through Noah, that rest is going to come. And again, if you read Luke 3, that rest is going to come through a who, not a what. It's going to come through a person, not a program. And that person is Jesus Christ. He will bring his people into rest with God. All of this to say in Genesis 4 and 5, that God is keeping his promise. As Israel reads this lineage, she is being reminded that God has made a promise in Genesis 3:15, and he has been preserving, he has been protecting, he has been nurturing, he has been guiding. Why? So that he can keep his promise that he made to Adam and Eve. And in a unique and special way, as descendants of Abraham, the nation of Israel has a unique role to play in that redemptive plan. They're connected with these people that they're reading about. It's interesting, too, that in Genesis 4:26, it says that in the time of Enoch, that people began to call on the name of the Lord. One of the major descriptions of Eve's children, of God's people, is that they call upon the name of the Lord. Now, the word call here makes it sound like they began to pray to God. But the word call here in the Hebrew would be better translated proclaim. We might say it this way. I might see Mike across the room and I might need him for something, or I might have something for him. And so I'd call out to him. I'd say, hey, Mike, wait up. I'm calling out for him, but what am I doing? I'm proclaiming good news to him. I got a Tim Hortons gift card for him maybe, or something like that. And what we see here in Genesis 4, one of the major characteristics of God's people, God's family, is that they talk about God with other people. They reveal about God's divine nature. They speak about God's goodness and grace to them. This is a pervading and invading thought of every aspect of their life. Whereas Cain gives no thought to the reality of God. Seth and his family, God's people, even the church today, as we're grafted in, the major focus of our life is the proclamation of the character and glory and gospel of God. Now, let's read this passage here, because one of the pervading concepts in Genesis chapter 5 is death, right? Genesis 3:15, there's going to be open hostility between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Death is going to reign. Death has reigned, particularly through Cain. But now we're going to begin to see generations and generations of even godly people cannot escape death. But I want you to notice as I read down through here, if you notice something out of place, okay? See if you can pick it up. Verse 4, the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. And when Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. Kenan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. And Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Jared 830 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Jared lived after he fathered Enoch 800 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And when Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech. Methuselah lived after he fathered Lamech 782 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. And when Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son, and he called his name Noah. And saying, out of the ground the Lord God has cursed, this one will bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. And Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years, and other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 775 years, and he died. And after Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. As we're reading down through verses 4 through 32, did anything stand out to you as being extremely abnormal? I hope as you were paying attention that starting with Seth, each of these people, though godly, though loving the Lord, though talking about his name and his faithfulness, guess what happened? They all succumbed to the great enemy, death. They did this, had this son, many other sons, lived this many years, and died, and died, and died, and died. But with Enoch, it says, in 300 years, he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. When Methuselah lived, and right back onto the death march. If you are the children of Israel and you are marching in the wilderness to the cadence of death, you're waiting 40 years for this generation to die off before you can go back in and try again. Okay? Death is real. Death is present. Death is uncontrollable. Death is it's the destiny of every person. But then all of a sudden, in this lineage of Seth, there's this exception. All of a sudden now, when death is all around us because of our sin, Enoch, who walked with God, just walked out of this life, and God took him into the next. And all of a sudden, and I hope for you and me, what it demonstrates to us is that this God, who is keeping his promise, has power of life and death. It's interesting as we look at Noah, or look at Enoch, it says that he walked with God. this phrase is only used of Enoch and Noah. It describes the most intimate communion. It has this idea of walking at God's side or walking beside God. Now, I want you to think about what we've studied thus far. In Genesis 1, 2, and 3, close your eyes and think. The words walk beside God or walk with God are only used of Enoch and Noah. But can you think of another example of a person or people who walked beside God daily? And I think your mind immediately turns to Adam and Eve. That in the garden, God came down seemingly at least once a day. And Adam and Eve would walk beside God in the dew of the evening, and they would just talk with him. They would commune with him. And this is what Enoch was doing. Now, it's interesting in Genesis 17 and Genesis 24, the phrase walking before God is used of people. And Deuteronomy 13:4, the word walking after God is used. Each of these phrases, very valuable, very good very good statements about the people, but it describes a blameless, moral, and ethical conduct. But walking beside God seems to imply more than just obedience. It implies obedience and communion, relationship. The phrase walking with God is used by the minor prophets to describe the intimate walk of a priest who entered the Holy of Holies to speak directly with God. It indicates the deepest obedience, and it indicates the deepest fellowship. Well, how's that possible? Well, Hebrews 11, 5 through 6 talks about Enoch. He talks about Enoch's walk of faith and how Enoch trusted God, and that trust in God pleased God. And what does that mean? It means that Enoch embraced God's path. He embraced God's company. He embraced God's fellowship. Enoch believed with all of his heart that God is who he said that he was or is. And Enoch believed that God rewards those who diligently seek him. Just as he believed that God was equitable, that God is fair, fair-minded, just, honorable, and reasonable, he also understood, as we see in Jude 14 and 15, that God rewards unrighteousness. And we see that played out in Cain's lineage. What we would say of Enoch is that Enoch's walk with God absorbed and pervaded all of his life. It says here in verse 22 that after he fathered Methuselah, that he lived on for 300 years. This doesn't mean that he wasn't living with God and then he did, but he was living with God. He was walking beside God. He had Methuselah and he kept on walking just like he was walking before. He had been living in intimacy with God. He continued on absorbed with this life and lifestyle until one day he was walking with God down here and boom, he was walking with God in his very presence. And although this is not a common human experience, the miraculous event demonstrates that God can make a way for mankind to escape death. How much more astounding Elijah is taken by the chariots. Lazarus is raised from the dead by the spoken power of the Word of God. And Jesus, by the own power in his own being as he is life and life, walks out of the grave. Okay? Man's greatest problem is death. And there's only one being in the universe that has the power to bring about life where death reigns, and that's God. The same God that could have annihilated Adam and Eve on sight in the garden, but has a plan and a purpose and wants a relationship. So what does he promise? I will restore you to a relationship with me. Not through a program, but through a person. And then Eve has a son. The disappointment of death stealing that son away, God provides another son. And he provides lots of sons for lots of people, but he provides Seth and Enoch. And then he provides Kenan, and the lineage goes down the line. And we see that the wandering wilderness generation of Israelites have a very important part to play in that, particularly the tribe of Judah, of the family of David, who comes to Jesus. Jesus has the way of restoring for us what we lost in the garden, a relationship with God, a right relationship with each other, and that he secured that again, not through a program, but through his own person. He brings life where only death reigns. I believe that Genesis chapter 5 ought to inspire more trust. You know, it's one thing for me to keep my promise once. It's really another thing for me to keep my promise twice. It would be amazing, almost impossible for me to keep every promise I've ever made for a lifetime. But if I could, wouldn't I be the most trustworthy person on the planet? I don't know about most, but I'd be pretty close. Okay. We have a God that made a promise centuries ago. And he didn't just keep his promise to one generation. Just in Genesis 5, up to Enoch is 7. Up to Noah, likely 8 or 9. And then by the time the wilderness wandering generation is reading it, we're talking about hundreds of years. By the time Jesus comes, thousands of years. After Jesus, 2,000 years to you and me today, God is still keeping his promise to save people and restore them to a right relationship with him. Now, I don't want to oversimplify today, but if God can be trusted to preserve his redemptive plan for centuries, just as he promised, don't you think God is trustworthy when it comes to our daily bread? When it comes to the care and the direction and protection of our children? When it comes to panicking over a pandemic, or it comes to a fear of what government is going to do, can God not be trusted with these things? When I'm concerned about a roof leak, or I'm concerned about an ailing loved one, I can be concerned, but who am I going to trust? Who am I going to throw my whole weight behind for my hope and my joy and my comfort? And I would just simply say here today that I think Genesis 4 and Genesis 5 makes a really good case for trusting God, who makes promises, who keeps promises generation after generation after generation, and who possesses in his own being the power of everlasting life. Let's pray. Father, we trust you with salvation. Help us trust you in the day-to-day. Help us, Father, to work out our salvation. That the gospel, that the promise of everlasting life, that the promise of unconditional love, that the promise of forgiveness, the promise of your presence, these are not things to be enjoyed just in eternity. These are things that we're to be absorbed with in the here and now, just like Enoch. And may it be said of us that we do more than just keep your moral code. May it be said of us that we don't just walk before you or behind you, though may that be true. May it be said of us that we walk with you, and only a life of trusting you can be described like that. That I don't run ahead, that I don't fall behind, that Matthew and God walk together daily. Father, I want that to be what my life is like, and I want that for my family, for my brothers and sisters here today. That, Father, we would trust you, and in trusting you, we would be known as a people that walk with you. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Blessings to you all.